Everyone calls the Confederacy of Independent Systems controlled opposition, a Sith puppet state that was never meant to win. But strip away Dooku, strip away Sidious, and what's left is over 1,000 star systems that looked at the Galactic Republic and said, "This galaxy is too large for one government." And they might have been right. The Republic's answer to that conclusion wasn't negotiation, it was a clone army. Commissioned in 32 BBY by a Jedi Master named Sifo-Dyas, who lied about having authorization from the Senate and the Jedi Council, grown on a planet called Kamino that was then deliberately erased from every official map, funded through channels that no Senate committee ever examined. The army trained in secret for 10 years before Obi-Wan Kenobi stumbled onto it while chasing a bounty hunter. Nobody questioned where it came from. The Republic deployed it anyway. The side openly building droid factories in territory it controlled got labeled the aggressor by the side that had assembled a secret military force using falsified authorization and an unaudited budget. The Galactic Republic's centralized structure is the real defendant in this story. The Outer Rim's reasons for leaving were structurally sound. The CIS built a functioning government with real institutional capacity before the war consumed it. And what happened to the Geonosians, whose planet hosted the Confederacy's founding and whose species was subsequently exterminated by the Empire to keep a secret they had helped create, represents the ultimate consequence of crushing Outer Rim self-determination. The Galactic Senate ran on a factional divide that determined every major economic outcome in the galaxy. Two competing philosophies operated inside the same chamber and produced legislative outcomes that were never actually random. The core faction advocated centralized government power and higher taxation, with the explicit aim of making the rest of the galaxy conform to core world standards. The Rim faction pushed back. Systems knew their own needs. Taxation should be lower. Autonomy should be real. These weren't abstract philosophical positions. They mapped directly onto a material reality in which the galaxy's wealthiest planets sat at the center and the poorest sat at the edges, and the Senate consistently produced outcomes that preserved that arrangement. Corporate entities held Senate seats, the Trade Federation, various guilds and federations, and exploited those positions for monetary gain. This meant the organizations profiting most aggressively from Outer Rim economic activity had direct legislative influence over the policies governing those territories. Simultaneously, junior representatives from minority factions could voice opinions in Senate chambers, but couldn't vote on or introduce new legislation. The institutional structure gave the loudest voices to the entities with the most to gain from keeping the Outer Rim economically accessible and politically weak. The Outer Rim's representation in the Senate was structurally limited. Against the full institutional weight of the core faction and the corporate lobbying apparatus that had shaped Republic trade policy for generations, the Outer Rim's legislative voice was marginal. The Senate's representation was characterized in contemporary political analysis as wildly out of balance from the start, an institution described, even by its defenders, as having no clear democracy and no coherent executive government. Too unwieldy to govern efficiently, too biased toward entrenched power to govern fairly. The Senate's decision to tax hyperspace routes, specifically in the outer and mid-rims, is where the machinery stops being abstract. That legislation created new taxation, targeting trade arteries in territories with the least political leverage to resist a new imposition. Not core routes, not the corridors serving the wealthy planets that had been extracting from the galaxy's edges for generations. The Phantom Menace's opening crawl puts it plainly. The taxation of trade routes to outlying star systems is in dispute. That sentence is where the saga begins, not with armies or lightsabers, but with a targeted fiscal policy applied to a region that had no effective means of blocking it. The Trade Federation's response, blockading Naboo, was disproportionate and brutal. The grievance underlying that response wasn't. Picture the practical texture of what that taxation measure meant at the operational level. Every freighter running spice from Kessel, every bulk hauler carrying Tabana gas from Outer Rim distribution points, every commercial transport moving between systems that the Republic's core world legislators had never visited and had no plans to visit. all of them now paying a tax whose revenues went toward a republic budget deficit that the Corps' own fiscal decisions had produced. The corporations running those routes weren't paying into a system that protected them. Crime syndicates dominated Outer Rim territories because the Republic had centuries of opportunity to address organized crime in those regions and consistently declined to make the effort. The Outer Rim Ore Works Company, a documented corporate entity in canon, located Outer Rim planets and extracted their gas and mineral resources as inputs for economies whose center of gravity sat light years away. Megacorporations throughout the region operated with documented callousness toward indigenous species, treating worlds at the galaxy's edge as extraction sites rather than communities. The enforcement gap made the structural exploitation concrete. The Republic's anti-slavery laws existed in Senate records. They didn't exist on Tatooine. In The Phantom Menace, Padme Amidala expresses shock that slavery persists in the Outer Rim. She's aware the Republic has laws against it. And Shmi Skywalker stops her mid-sentence. The Republic doesn't. The sentence ends there. The Republic doesn't govern here. It doesn't protect here. The law stopped at the precise boundary where enforcing it stopped being economically convenient. A family living as property on a desert world several parsecs from the nearest core-aligned population center discovered, concretely, that the Republic's legal architecture was selective in exactly the ways that benefited the already powerful. This is the dynamic political scientists call a Thucydides trap, applied to galactic space rather than Mediterranean city-states. The dominant power doesn't need to be consciously malicious. It just needs to keep winning within a system it designed, extracting resources cheap and keeping the periphery politically dependent, until the weaker party exhausts its patience or its options. The Republic was winning. The Outer Rim was exhausted. That targeted taxation was one more mechanism in a pattern that had been operating for centuries, present when revenue was involved, absent when protection was required. That selective reach is what made the secessionist argument structurally coherent rather than merely emotional. By 24 BBY, the political escalation had a name, a capital, and a governing architecture. And it's worth being precise about what that architecture actually was, because it was more developed than the word separatist typically implies. The Confederacy of Independent Systems established Raxus Secundus, an Outer Rim planet, as its formal capital. This wasn't a symbolic gesture made in haste. The CIS planted its governmental center geographically inside the territory whose interests it claimed to represent. Raxus Secundus hosted a civilian separatist senate that functioned as a legislature alongside an executive council of corporate leadership. Elected representatives from member worlds sat in a planetary capital that was accessible to the populations they governed, not positioned in the core among the institutions they had rejected. The geographic commitment of the CIS's seat of government to the Outer Rim expressed something about its political priorities that the Galactic Senate's permanent position on Coruscant expressed about the Republic's. The CIS founding assembly took place on Geonosis in 22 BBY. 5 major galactic entities, the Trade Federation, the Intergalactic Banking Clan, the Techno-Union, the Commerce Guild, and the Corporate Alliance, committed their forces and resources by formal compact. This wasn't a rebellion taking shape in cantinas and encrypted transmissions. It was a signing ceremony. Institutional representatives with authority to bind their organizations appeared before witnesses, committed resources, and formalized a political and military alliance with documented membership. The Confederacy didn't emerge from shadows. It assembled on the surface of a planet, in structures built by Geonosian engineers, and announced what it was. What made Raxus Secundus significant wasn't just its location. The civilian separatist senate that convened there was a functioning legislature with actual member governments possessing their own administrative capacity, their own populations, their own ongoing responsibilities of governance that continued regardless of what was happening at the military front. In the systems that joined the CIS and weren't immediately the site of active combat, those responsibilities were being met by governments that had chosen the Confederacy's political framework over the Republic's. Whether that framework would have delivered on its stated commitments, decentralization, systems rights, lower taxation, genuine regional autonomy, is a question the war prevented from ever being tested at scale. But the institutional capacity to attempt it was real. The CIS wasn't a skeleton waiting for flesh. It was a working structure that needed time it wasn't permitted to have. Count Dooku served as the movement's political and charismatic leader. He delivered the Raxus address, commandeering a HoloNet relay to broadcast across the galaxy, describing the Republic as corrupt and systematically tilted toward core worlds. At the moment he said it, that characterization was factually defensible. The core faction's legislative dominance, the targeted nature of the Outer Rim taxation, the documented enforcement gap, these weren't secrets. Dooku was a Jedi Master who had spent decades inside the Republic's orbit, watching its institutions from positions of knowledge, and his diagnosis of its structural pathology was grounded in observable evidence. This is what made him effective. Thousands of star systems don't secede on the basis of a single charismatic speech. They secede when the speech articulates something they already knew. Thousands of systems began formally leaving the Republic, citing neglect and systemic abandonment by core worlds. Multiple additional worlds joined the Confederacy throughout the war, not primarily because Dooku personally recruited them, but because the Republic kept failing to give them compelling reasons to stay. The governing philosophy the CIS articulated was the structural inverse of everything that had made the Republic's relationship with the Outer Rim so grinding and extractive. Whether the CIS would have delivered that philosophy in practice, nobody got the chance to find out. In 32 BBY, the same year the Naboo crisis elevated Palpatine to Supreme Chancellor, Jedi Master Sifo-Dyas met with the cloners of Kamino. Sifo-Dyas had been experiencing forced premonitions of a coming galactic conflict. The visions were specific enough to convince him that war wasn't a distant possibility, but a functional inevitability. He brought his warnings to the Jedi Council. The Council reviewed them and rejected them, finding insufficient cause to act on the scale his premonitions seemed to demand. That rejection matters. The institutional safeguard designed to prevent unilateral action by individual Jedi did exactly what it was designed to do. It said no. Sifo-Dyas went to Kamino anyway. The Kaminoans were professional contractors. They agreed to produce a standing army, worked out the specifications, confirmed the genetic template, and began. What they didn't verify, and perhaps never thought to verify, was that the authorization Sifo-Dyas claimed to carry was entirely fabricated. He told them the Senate had requested the army. The Senate had not. He told them the Jedi Council had approved the commission. The Council had declined to approve anything. The two foundational facts underpinning the legitimacy of the entire military production program were fabricated simultaneously. Then Dooku had him killed. The Pike Syndicate shot down Sifo-Dyas' shuttle while he was departing on a separate mission, a contract arranged by Dooku under Sith direction. After his death, Dooku systematically erased Kamino from the Jedi archives, along with more than 35 other star systems, removing every cartographic record of the planet's existence from the only centralized information network the Jedi and Republic maintained. Kamino didn't become a secret that people knew existed, but couldn't discuss. It became a planet that couldn't be found, because the tools for finding it had been cleaned. The army grew through the following decade. Clone troopers were engineered from the genetic template of Jango Fett, raised through accelerated growth cycles, trained and equipped and organized into what would eventually become the Grand Army of the Republic. On Kamino, the Kaminoans expanded the order, refining the product, waiting for the client who had commissioned them to come check on the progress, while no Republic senator asked a budget committee to account for the funding. There was nothing in the official budget to account for. No Jedi archivist flagged the disappearance of 35 star systems from the official star charts. No committee opened an investigation into what had happened to Sifo-Dyas. The institutional silence was maintained not through a sprawling cover-up requiring hundreds of participants to stay quiet, but by one act: erasing the planet from the map. If you couldn't find Kamino, you couldn't ask what was being produced there. In 22 BBY, Obi-Wan Kenobi arrived on Kamino while investigating the origins of a saber dart used by bounty hunter Jango Fett. The dart was Kaminoan manufacture. The planet shouldn't have existed in the Jedi archives. It had been removed. Kenobi found it anyway, guided by coordinates identified through the dart's composition. When he landed, Prime Minister Lama Su received him with the professional warmth of a contractor who had been expecting client contact for some time. The army was coming along beautifully, Lama Su explained. Ordered by Sifo-Dyas at the request of the Senate. The 10-year production run was proceeding on schedule. Lama Su wasn't being deceptive. He believed every word he said. In a transactional relationship built on institutional trust, you have no mechanism to verify. Decade-long silence looks a lot like confirmation. The Jedi Council convened to discuss what Kenobi had found. The alarm was genuine. They had an army commissioned in their name, grown on a planet erased from their own records, by a colleague now dead under circumstances that had never been fully explained. This was the moment for the kind of institutional scrutiny that would normally accompany the discovery of an unauthorized military program of this scale. An investigation into who had paid for the Kamino operation. A determination of whether Sifo-Dyas had acted alone. A formal Senate inquiry into how a decade-long military production program had operated without any public funding authorization. The Jedi Council held a brief, alarmed conversation about where the army had come from, and then deployed it. Before anyone established who had actually paid for it, who had truly ordered it, or whether any democratic institution had ever sanctioned its creation, the clone army was fighting the opening battle of the Clone Wars at Geonosis. The legal mechanism for deploying it came through Jar Jar Binks, serving as acting senator for Naboo while Padme Amidala was absent from Coruscant. He moved in the Senate to grant Palpatine emergency powers. The Senate voted to approve. What had begun as one Jedi's falsely authorized commission to a cloning facility on an erased planet became, through a motion introduced by a representative, functioning as a legislative placeholder for someone who would have opposed the very motion he was introducing, the military foundation of the Republic's war effort. The Grand Army of the Republic was now legal, retroactively, via emergency powers. It was fighting before anyone had formally voted on whether it should exist. The CIS was building weapons in territory it openly governed, with resources its member organizations actually owned, under a governance structure it had publicly announced on Geonosis before witnesses. The Republic was deploying a military force secretly commissioned with false institutional authority, grown on a planet deliberately hidden from official records, deployed via emergency powers introduced through a motion whose proposer didn't understand the consequences of what he was introducing. Both sides got called to war. Only one of them got called the aggressors. Count Dooku is the hardest figure in this argument to handle correctly. Precision matters more here than anywhere else. He was the oldest living Jedi at the time he left the Order, a distinction that implies not just seniority, but decades of accumulated observation of the Republic's institutions, its corruptions, its systematic failure to deliver on its own stated principles. He had watched the Senate's factional machinery produce outcomes that consistently favored core worlds. He had watched Outer Rim territories persist in conditions the Republic's legal frameworks nominally prohibited. He had watched the institution he served function as a legitimating apparatus for an economic arrangement it lacked either the will or the structure to challenge. After his departure from the Order, he reclaimed his title as Count of Sereno, an aristocratic inheritance from one of the wealthier, more established worlds in the galaxy, not an Outer Rim territory of the type his political rhetoric would claim to champion. This is the incongruity worth holding. The face of the most significant Outer Rim secessionist movement in galactic history was an aristocrat from a core-adjacent world who had spent his career inside the very institutions he was now denouncing. That incongruity didn't undermine the movement's popular appeal. It complicated the question of whose interests the movement ultimately served. His criticisms of the Republic were structurally accurate. The Raxus Address said what thousands of systems across the Outer Rim already knew from direct experience. The Republic was burdened by corruption. It exhibited systematic favoritism toward core worlds. Its legislative architecture produced outcomes that preserved the material advantage of planets whose populations had benefited for generations from Outer Rim labor and resources. Dooku's diagnosis wasn't invented for political effect. He had watched the system operate from inside it for decades, and what he described was what he had seen. In Legends material, his orientation toward Outer Rim concerns appears to have been genuine at some level, rather than purely instrumental. What makes this tragic rather than simply hypocritical is the gap between that genuine orientation and his function within Palpatine's plan, which required the war to continue indefinitely. Dooku answered simultaneously to the CIS membership and to Palpatine, whose scheme required neither side to win. The Clone Wars lasted 3 years, spanning thousands of systems, consuming the combined military capacity of 5 major corporate factions and a purpose-engineered clone army. They ended not because of a decisive Republic breakthrough in the field, but because Palpatine had Dooku killed and dispatched a new instrument to Mustafar. The Separatist cause didn't collapse under military pressure. It was executed. By the midpoint of the Clone Wars, the Confederacy had a functioning capital on Raxus Secundus, where its civilian Senate continued to convene and deliberate. Member worlds had been living under CIS governance in territories away from the active combat theaters for years. General Grievous operated as Supreme Commander, coordinating droid armies across multiple simultaneous operational theaters. The military pressure the CIS was generating was real enough to require continuous Republic response across the war's full 3-year duration. Grievous's military record has been collapsed in popular storytelling into a narrative of consistent failure. That reading emerges from evaluating a general's results within a strategic situation that his own commanding officer had a structural interest in keeping stalemated. Assessing operational competence through results produced under those constraints distorts the picture. He was a general, managing armies across a war his political superior was structurally committed to prolonging. The evidence that the CIS military sustained 3 years of meaningful battlefield pressure against purpose-engineered clone forces, forces that had genuine tactical advantages at the individual unit level, suggests the operational performance underlying those 3 years came from somewhere real. Grievous commanded the army producing it. Remove Dooku. Give Grievous operational authority, backed by civilian government genuinely pursuing victory. A Separatist council no longer operating under leadership whose interests didn't align with CIS success. The military calculation changes in ways that can't be resolved into a certain CIS victory. But stop treating CIS defeat as automatic. Droid production capacity operated at a scale the Republic struggled to counter. Territorial control spanned hundreds of systems, with populations invested in the outcome. Logistics rested on the combined industrial output of 5 corporate factions, whose organizational competence, whatever their ethical shortcomings, was real and established. The Grand Army had purpose-engineered soldiers with genuine tactical advantages. The CIS had industrial scale and territorial depth. These aren't the ingredients of inevitable defeat. The governing philosophy the Confederacy articulated, systems rights, lower taxation, decentralized authority, genuine regional autonomy, was the structural inverse of the model that had produced Outer Rim neglect for generations. No government reliably delivers on its founding principles once it has to actually govern. That uncertainty applies equally to the Republic and the CIS. What the Confederacy had, by the war's midpoint, was more institutional infrastructure than most secessionist movements ever achieve. A sitting civilian legislature, a named capital accessible to the populations it served, a military chain of command, member governments with their own administrative structures, a working political project that needed time it wasn't permitted to have, under leadership that wasn't trying to give it any. The honest version of this argument requires addressing the counter-argument directly. What did the Separatist Council actually know? The case for Council awareness of Dooku's true allegiances isn't weak. Newt Gunray had survived formal Jedi investigation of the Naboo invasion. An actor of that institutional durability doesn't operate in political environments without a finely calibrated sense of when the room is lying to him. The intergalactic banking clan had spent decades navigating the Senate's financial corridors. The Commerce Guild and Techno Union, organizations whose survival depended on reading political environments correctly for generations. The suggestion that experienced actors of this caliber simply failed to notice that their leaders' objectives didn't align with their own requires either extraordinary credulity on their part or extraordinary information management on Dooku's. But being aware that Dooku was operating within Sith interests and understanding the full architecture of what that meant are different claims at very different confidence levels. That Palpatine was simultaneously directing the Republic's war effort, that the entire conflict was designed to terminate not in CIS victory or Republic victory, but in the declaration of a galactic empire. Being sophisticated doesn't mean having access to information that was being carefully managed by someone more sophisticated than all of them. Newt Gunray, Wat Tambor of the Techno Union, Shu Mai of the Commerce Guild, San Hill of the Intergalactic Banking Clan, none of them are confirmed in the available record to have been aware of the full Sith orchestration. They committed organizational resources to a political and military project that offered concrete benefits: liberation from Republic taxation, preservation of their corporate interests in territories where they operated, a governing structure that gave corporate entities structural influence rather than just legislative access. These were transactional motivations. Transactional actors don't need to know the full architecture of the arrangement they're participating in. They need to know what they're getting. What the pattern of their ending reveals is more telling than the pattern of their participation. After Dooku's death at the Battle of Coruscant, General Grievous arranged for the surviving council members to be transported to Mustafar for what he described as their safety. They went. People who understood they were co-architects of a Sith grand plan, aware participants in a scheme designed to produce an emperor, don't board a transport to a remote volcanic planet immediately after their commanding general is killed, under the assurance that it will be safe. That's not how you treat partners in a successful conspiracy. That's how you relocate liabilities. Every CIS corporate faction that survived the Clone Wars was dissolved or nationalized by the Empire. Assets absorbed, organizational structures eliminated. Newt Gunray died on Mustafar, and the Trade Federation's resources transferred directly into the Imperial State. The Intergalactic Banking Clan, the Techno Union, the Commerce Guild, the Corporate Alliance, each dismantled, each absorbed, each discarded by the government they'd supposedly been helping install. The entities that had joined the Confederacy because Republican centralization harmed their economic interests received, upon the Confederacy's defeat, a centralization that made the Republic look permissive. The cause they'd backed, decentralization, autonomy, systems rights, produced through their defeat the structural opposite of everything they'd claimed to want. This isn't the pattern of an emperor rewarding co-conspirators. It's the pattern of a victor eliminating everyone who had served their purpose and now knew too much. The emotional weight of this entire argument converges on a planet the galaxy forgot was ever inhabited. Geonosis was where it began. In 22 BBY, the Battle of Geonosis opened the Clone Wars, and the Geonosian species was present at every layer of what that moment meant. Their factories had been manufacturing Separatist battle droids for years before the conflict became open warfare. The hive mind architecture of Geonosian engineering, the massive foundry complexes that the species had constructed across their desert world, the industrial infrastructure of an entire civilization, all of it committed to producing the droid armies of a confederacy that had promised the Outer Rim something structurally different from the Republic. The CIS founding assembly took place on Geonosian soil, in structures built by Geonosian engineers. The Confederacy's military and political birth was inseparable from the Geonosian people's political bet on what that confederacy represented. Archduke Poggle the Lesser was the public leader of the Geonosian people throughout the Clone Wars and a leading member of the Separatist Council. He was present at the founding. He was present in the war councils. He was present in the decisions that defined what the CIS was trying to become. He was also a Geonosian sovereign, outward-facing, managing his civilization's relationship with the galactic political forces that were determining its future. What Poggle didn't know, and couldn't have known, was what his engineering expertise was building toward. The Death Star plans were significantly improved by Geonosian technical contribution, his species' mastery of large-scale construction, insectoid hive engineering applied to structures of a scale no individual architect could conceive. That expertise was extracted and embedded into the plans carried forward by the Empire, into a construction project the Geonosian species wasn't going to be invited to observe once they had finished being useful. The Empire selected Geonosis as the Death Star's construction site. Geonosian industrial knowledge and engineering expertise made the planet's workforce essential during the early construction phase. Travel to the Geonosis system was restricted once work began, a security perimeter drawn around a world whose population had been foundational to the very weapon under construction. When the phase requiring specialized Geonosian contribution had been completed, once the expertise had been embedded in the design and the initial construction had advanced past the point where it required the species that had made it possible, the Empire deployed poison canisters in a systematic sterilization campaign across the planet's surface. The operation killed all but one Geonosian. The stated motive was the Death Star's secrecy. Lay that sequence out in full. The Geonosian people hosted the Confederacy's founding assembly. Their factories built its droid armies. Their Archduke sat on its governing council. They fought in the opening battle of a war they believed was about their political future, and their species standing in a galaxy that had extracted from them and neglected them. They lost that war. Under the Empire, their planet became the construction site for the weapon their own engineering expertise had helped design. When the construction phase requiring their labor ended, the Empire killed them to protect the secret of what they had helped build. 17 years passed before anyone discovered what had happened. Around 2 BBY, Saw Gerrera, the crew of the Ghost, and Captain Rex investigated the Geonosis system and found a planet inexplicably devoid of life. The silence of a world that had once been covered in hive structures, foundry complexes, and the constant industrial sound of a civilization at full production. That silence was itself the evidence. What they uncovered confirmed a systematic extermination, a species politically erased from its own world, biologically eliminated without any surviving institution powerful enough to raise a formal objection, gone without record or acknowledgement for nearly 2 decades. Senate taxation had targeted their trade routes. The Republic's legal protections hadn't extended to their territory. They had joined the Confederacy because it promised something structurally different from what the Republic had delivered. That Confederacy was undermined by its own leadership. The war ended. The Empire extracted their engineering knowledge. Then it sterilized them to protect the secret their work had created. Poggle the Lesser was captured during the Second Battle of Geonosis during the Clone Wars, managed to defect back to the Separatists, and was killed on Mustafar by Anakin Skywalker at the conclusion of the Clone Wars. The arc of his life runs from Geonosian Archduke to Separatist founding member, to prisoner of war, to defector back to the cause he believed in, and finally to a volcanic planet where the man sent to execute him had been dispatched by the same architect who had built the movement Poggle had given his civilization to. He died without knowing the full shape of what he had been part of. Nobody who understood that destination would have handed over the blueprints for their own people's destruction. 17 years later, the Empire sterilized his planet. His species died to protect a secret their own expertise had created. The weapon his people's engineering had improved became the instrument of a galactic terror campaign that made the Clone Wars look like a regional dispute. This is what Outer Rim self-determination cost on Geonosis. Not the initial battle, not the droid foundries, the biological erasure of a species that had made a political bet on decentralization, and lost, because the man running their movement was working for the other side the entire time. 19 BBY. The sequence leading to Mustafar unfolds over roughly half a day, and the weight of what it means depends entirely on what Anakin Skywalker understood when he boarded the ship. Anakin reports to Mace Windu that Palpatine is a Sith Lord. Windu takes 3 masters and goes to arrest him. Anakin follows. He stands at the intersection of everything he believes about the Jedi Order and everything he needs from the man on the floor, and then chooses. severing Windu's sword hand, allowing Palpatine to kill him with Force lightning. Anakin pledges himself as Darth Vader within minutes of watching a Jedi Master die at his own intervention. Palpatine then dispatches him to Mustafar with instructions to take care of the Separatist Council. Anakin knew Palpatine was Sith when he boarded that ship. That much the sequence establishes. What the canon record does not confirm is whether Palpatine told him, in the hours between Windu's death and the Mustafar departure, the full scope of what the Clone Wars had been. That the Separatist movement had been engineered from its inception as a manufactured crisis. That the conflict had been run from both sides toward a predetermined outcome. That the people Anakin was being sent to kill were, in the most consequential sense, Palpatine's own instruments, not the genuine adversaries they appeared to be. The gap between knowing Palpatine was Sith and understanding that Palpatine had built the Separatist movement from the beginning and directed the war from both sides toward this exact moment isn't a small gap. It's the entire revelation. So Anakin moves through the Separatist Council chamber on Mustafar. The building is quiet in the way that places become quiet when everyone inside knows something is wrong, but has committed too far to leave. The council members had been told Mustafar was safe. Grievous himself had arranged the transport after Dooku's death at Coruscant, framing the move as a security measure, a place to wait out the final phase. They were waiting for news about what came next. What came next walked through the door in black armor, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who has already made a decision and is simply completing it. Newt Gunray, Viceroy of the Trade Federation, the Neimoidian who had blockaded an entire planet over a taxation grievance that was, in structural terms, not wrong, even if the method was brutal and his subsequent choices worse. He had spent years in the CIS's orbit, sophisticated enough to survive multiple Jedi investigations, not sophisticated enough to understand what he had actually been part of. Wat Tambor of the Techno Union, whose organization's industrial capacity had been foundational to the droid armies now running out the clock on the war they'd been built to fight. Shu Mai of the Commerce Guild. San Hill of the Intergalactic Banking Clan. Each of them had committed organizational resources to a political project that had promised the Outer Rim something structurally different from what the Republic had delivered. Each bore real responsibility for real violence over 3 years of open war. None of them understood the full picture. And Poggle the Lesser, Archduke of Geonosis, public leader of a species that had made its political bet on the Confederacy at the founding assembly, on their own planet, in structures their own engineers had built. Who had contributed to the Death Star's design without knowing what it would become, or what the Empire would do to his people once the construction phase requiring their expertise was finished? Who had been transported to Mustafar under Grievous's assurance that it would be safe, killed in that chamber by the same blade that ended every other voice in the room. He died without knowing that the man who built the political movement he had given his civilization to was the same man who had sent his killer. He died without knowing his people's engineering would outlast them, that the weapon they had helped design would be completed by an empire that had eliminated them to protect the secret. He died as the face of a cause that was legitimate in its foundations and corrupted in its execution, killed by a man who may not have fully understood what he was dismantling. The Mustafar scene has never been allowed to carry its own dramatic irony. A new Sith Lord, sent by the war's architect to kill the architect's own instruments, executing people who were, in varying degrees, with varying levels of conscious cooperation, also victims of the same system that had used them and then decided they knew too much. The Separatist Council bore real responsibility for real violence. It wasn't, however, what it was being killed for being. It was what had been used and then discarded when the use was complete. The Confederacy of Independent Systems was founded on real political grievance in a republic whose centralized structure had economically extracted the Outer Rim, left its anti-slavery laws unenforced on specific named planets, allowed crime syndicates to operate unchallenged across centuries, and passed a taxation regime specifically targeting the territories with the least power to resist. Its capital sat in the Outer Rim. Its civilian government met and deliberated. Its military held the Republic to a 3-year stalemate across thousands of star systems. Its member worlds represented populations with legitimate structural arguments for self-determination, populations who had been economically extracted, legally abandoned, and systematically underrepresented in the institution that claimed to govern them. It was led by a man whose function was to ensure it failed. That is established background, not revelation. What matters is the consequence. The legitimate cause underneath the corruption never got a fair test of whether it was viable. The 1,000+ star systems that said, "This galaxy is too large for one government," never received an honest answer to whether they were right. The man who engineered the outcome from both sides replaced the Republic with something worse. Immediately, without interruption, and without the surviving Separatist institutional infrastructure that might have offered resistance. The Outer Rim worlds that had seceded spent the Imperial era under the most centralized government the galaxy had ever seen, with no functioning Senate capable of constraining it, no Outer Rim lobby withstanding to object, and no surviving corporate factions capable of applying financial leverage against it. The Thucydides trap that had driven the original secession wasn't broken by the Clone Wars. It was completed. The center absorbed the periphery's resources, eliminated the institutional capacity that might have challenged it again, and continued. Geonosis was cleaned of its people, sanitized of its history, and sealed. Discovered 17 years later by people who weren't looking for a genocide, just trying to understand why a planet was silent. One question from the Mustafar scene doesn't resolve. When Anakin Skywalker moved through the council chamber and ended the people inside it, the canon record leaves genuinely uncertain whether he understood that the man who sent him had designed the entire movement his blade was dismantling. The silence is the only answer the evidence provides. The Confederacy of Independent Systems was hijacked, slaughtered, and erased from galactic memory, and the galaxy that replaced it was ruled by the man who had engineered the whole thing from both sides. Subscribe for more stories like this.